There's a moment in every war when the map changes, not because of a single battle, not because of a single speech, but because a new player walks onto the stage, and everything you thought you understood about the conflict suddenly needs to be rewritten. That moment happened on Saturday morning, March 28th, 2026, and it did not come from Tehran. It did not come from Washington. It did not come from Tel Aviv. It came from a country that most people had almost forgotten about in the chaos of the last 4 weeks. It came from Yemen, and when it came, it changed everything. Sit with that for a second. Yemen, a country that has been ravaged by civil war for more than a decade, a country where children were dying of cholera and hunger while the world looked away. A country that the United States had bombed just last year in a campaign that cost more than $1 billion. That country, on a Saturday morning in late March 2026, fired a barrage of ballistic missiles at Israel. And the war that was already the most dangerous conflict in a generation just got more dangerous. Let me take you back to the beginning, not the beginning of today. The beginning of everything that produced today. Because you cannot understand this moment without understanding the long and winding road that led to it. It starts in 2014, not 2026, not 2023, 2014. That is the year a group most of the world had never heard of captured the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. They called themselves Ansar Allah. The world called them the Houthis. They carried green flags and black rifles and a slogan so blunt it left nothing to the imagination. Death to America, death to Israel, a curse on the Jews, victory to Islam. That was their motto, that was their identity, and that was their promise. They came from the mountains of northern Yemen, a Zaidi Shia movement that had been fighting the Yemeni government since 2004. For years they were a local problem, a domestic insurgency, a civil war footnote. Nobody outside the region cared very much. And then Iran noticed them. Iran saw in the Houthis what it had always sought, a proxy force positioned at a choke point that could strangle the global economy without Iran ever having to fire a single missile itself. Because Yemen is not just a poor country at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen sits on something priceless. Yemen controls the Bab al-Mandab, and most people do not know what the Bab al-Mandab is, but they have felt its effects every single time they filled up a gas tank or bought something that traveled by ship. The Bab al-Mandab is a strait, a narrow passage of water, just 18 miles wide at its tightest point. It sits between Yemen on one side and Djibouti and Eritrea on the other. It is the gateway between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And everything traveling by sea between Asia and Europe must pass through it. Container ships, oil tankers, liquefied natural gas carriers. Every year, trillions of dollars in goods funnel through that 18-mile gap. An estimated 6 to 7 million barrels of oil per day transit the Bab al-Mandab, along with a significant share of global container traffic linking Asia to Europe. Kuwa, 6 to 7 million barrels, every single day, through a strait the Houthis sit right next to. Iran understood this years before the rest of the world did, and so Iran began building the Houthis into something far more dangerous than a mounted insurgency. Iranian personnel arrived in Yemen working alongside Hezbollah militants. Their role involved directing and overseeing Houthi attacks. Iran escalated its provision of advanced drones, anti-ship cruise missiles, precision strike ballistic missiles, and medium-range missiles to the Houthis. Jinsa, Iran did not just give them weapons. Iran gave them knowledge. Iran gave them technology. Iran gave them the ability to hit targets over 1,500 kilometers away. And Iran gave them something else that money cannot buy. Iran gave them a cause, a narrative, a role in the biggest conflict in the Middle East since 1948, the axis of resistance, a term that sounds almost romantic until you understand what it means in practice. It means Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, militias in Iraq, and now, sitting at the southern end of the Red Sea, the Houthis in Yemen. Every single one of these groups answers to a different chain of command. Every single one has its own political agenda. But they are all connected by one thread: opposition to Israel, opposition to the United States, and loyalty, in varying degrees, to Tehran. Now fast forward to October 2023. The Gaza war begins, and the Houthis do something that shocks the world. They start launching missiles at Israel from Yemen across more than 1,800 kilometers of open sky. The Houthis launched over 130 ballistic missiles and dozens of explosive-laden drones at Israel, including one that killed a civilian and wounded several others in Tel Aviv in July 2024. War. They seized ships in the Red Sea. They attacked commercial vessels. They forced entire shipping lanes to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 weeks and millions of dollars to every voyage. Shipping volumes in the Red Sea plummeted with traffic through the Suez Canal down 70% by mid-2024. Hudson Institute One Group, in one of the poorest countries on Earth, brought the global shipping industry to its knees. The United States responded. It launched Operation Prosperity Guardian. It sent warships. It conducted airstrikes. It spent over $1 billion bombing Houthi positions in Yemen in early 2025. And then President Trump declared a ceasefire, and the Houthis held their fire. The shipping lanes slowly began to recover. By the end of 2025, tankers were cautiously returning to the Red Sea. The crisis seemed to be winding down. And then February 28th, 2026 happened. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, the most significant American military action in the Middle East in decades. Massive strikes against Iran, targeting its missile program, its nuclear infrastructure, its naval forces, its command centers. The region exploded overnight. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. The price of oil skyrocketed. Gulf Arab states started getting hit by Iranian missiles. The USS Gerald R. Ford carrier group moved into position. American troops flooded into the region, and the Houthis watched and waited. That patience was deliberate. It was strategic. Iran appeared to be managing escalation gradually and keeping the Houthis in reserve. CENTCOM. Rather than activating all fronts at once, Iran was choosing its moment, holding its last card. Because the Houthis were not just another militia, they were the piece that could open a second front, a second strait, a second catastrophe for the global economy. For 4 weeks, the Houthis issued warnings. Their leaders spoke on television. Their spokesperson gave interviews. They said their fingers were on the trigger. They said they were ready. They said they were watching. And military analysts around the world held their breath. Then, on Friday, March 27th, the Houthi spokesperson issued a statement that was deliberately vague. He signaled something was coming. He did not say what. He did not say when. But the language was unmistakable. And within hours, the answer came. Early Saturday morning, March 28th, 2026. The sirens began. They went off first around Beersheba, the major city in Israel's Negev desert, then in the communities surrounding it, then near something that made the entire region go cold. The sirens sounded near Israel's main nuclear research center, the Negev Nuclear Research Center, a facility whose very existence Israel does not officially acknowledge. And now Houthi ballistic missiles were flying in its direction. The Houthi military spokesperson announced the attack on the rebels' satellite television channel. He stated that the Yemeni armed forces had carried out their first military operation firing a barrage of ballistic missiles, targeting sensitive military positions for the Israeli enemy. CBS News, a barrage, not one missile, a barrage. The statement declared that attacks will continue until the declared objectives are achieved, and until the aggression against all fronts of the resistance ceases. CBS News, all fronts. That phrase is important. Not just Iran. All fronts, Lebanon, Iraq, Gaza, Iran, every theater where the axis of resistance is fighting. The Houthis were not just entering this war, they were declaring themselves part of a coordinated campaign across the entire region simultaneously. Israel's military confirmed the launch. Air defense systems were activated, and one missile was intercepted. No casualties were reported from this particular strike, but the intercepted missile is not the story. The story is that Yemen fired at all. Now let's understand what the Houthis are actually capable of, because most people hear Yemeni rebels and imagine a ragtag force with rusting Kalashnikovs. That is not what the Houthis are in 2026, not even close. The Houthi arsenal includes the Tufan ballistic missile with a range of 1,900 kilometers, the Quds-2 missile with a range of 2,000 kilometers, and Samad drones with a range of 2,000 kilometers. Wikipedia, 2,000 kilometers. From their launch sites in Yemen, that range covers Israel. It covers Saudi Arabia. It covers the United Arab Emirates. It covers every American military base in the Gulf. It covers the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, wherever it sits in the Arabian Sea. And it covers the oil terminals and shipping lanes that keep the global economy breathing. The Houthis have incorporated an increasingly sophisticated range of ballistic and cruise missile systems, enabling them to launch precise strikes across distances exceeding 1,500 kilometers. The Quds-2 land attack cruise missile is designed for long-range precision strikes and evasion of radar detection through low-altitude flight. Flashpoint low-altitude flight. That is the detail that keeps defense analysts awake at night. High-flying ballistic missiles are visible on radar. They can be tracked. They can be intercepted. But a cruise missile flying low and slow under the radar line is a fundamentally different problem. It is harder to see, harder to track, harder to shoot down, and the Houthis have them. Now, let's talk about what their entry into this war actually means beyond the missiles themselves. Remember the Strait of Hormuz. Iran closed it when this war began. The world's oil market went into crisis because roughly 1/5 of global oil flows through that single passage. Saudi Arabia tried to compensate by rerouting oil through its east-west pipeline, pumping oil overland from the Gulf to its port on the Red Sea called Yanbu, and then shipping it through the Red Sea instead of through Hormuz. It was working. Barely. but it was working. And then the Houthis entered the war. Saudi Arabia has been redirecting millions of barrels of oil from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea via its east-west pipeline since the war began. There's a large number of tankers now making the Red Sea transit to pick up crude from Yanbu. This is very important for oil markets because it relieves pressure from the total shutting of the Persian Gulf. But if the Houthis attacked Yanbu, and if they did enough to disrupt exports from the terminal, then the world would be looking at a disruption of 7 million barrels per day. CENTCOM. 7 million barrels per day. Gone. On top of the barrels already missing because of Hormuz. If the Strait of Hormuz is hit, oil struggles to leave the Gulf. If the Bab al-Mandab is blocked, it struggles to reach Europe. If both are hit, the route breaks end to end. Qua, both, hit, at the same time. This is not a theoretical scenario anymore. This is where the world is right now. Iran has effectively closed Hormuz. The Houthis are now firing missiles at Israel from Yemen. And a senior Houthi advisor said publicly after Saturday's strike that the group has developed a plan to prevent the passage of Israeli ships through the Bab al-Mandab Strait. A Houthi-affiliated analyst said Yemen's entry into the war was intended to complicate the scene for the Americans and Israelis. He cited Yemen's geographic position as a key factor pointing to Yemen's leverage over critical maritime routes, including the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Bab al-Mandab Strait. He argued that such positioning directly impacts military navigation and constrains the operational flexibility of United States and Israeli forces in the region. SOF, news constrain. That word is carefully chosen. The Houthis are not trying to win a conventional war. They know they cannot defeat the United States military head-to-head. That is not the goal. The goal is to make American power in the region more expensive, more complicated, more stretched. Every missile the United States has to intercept from Yemen is a missile it has to pay for. Every tanker that diverts around Africa is a tanker that costs the global economy millions more. Every nervous shipping company that pulls its vessels out of the Red Sea is another link in the supply chain that breaks. This is asymmetric warfare at its most sophisticated, and the Houthis are extraordinarily good at it. Now let's put Saturday's events in their full context, because Yemen was not the only thing happening that day. Israel had just struck Iran's nuclear facilities. The night before Saturday's Houthi attack, Israel's air force hit sites deep inside Iran, targeting the nuclear infrastructure that Tehran has spent decades building in secret. The strikes triggered a massive Iranian response. Iran fired 6 ballistic missiles and 29 drones at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia in a Friday attack that injured at least 15 troops, including 5 seriously. The aviationist. Meanwhile, Iran and Hezbollah continued firing at Israel overnight. Loud explosions filled the air in Tel Aviv. Israel's fire and rescue service said it was responding to 11 different impact sites across the Tel Aviv metro area. The aviationist, and in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Oman. Missiles and drones were striking infrastructure. A drone attack targeting Kuwait International Airport damaged its radar system. Kuwait's National Guard downed 6 drones in the past 24 hours. An Oman port was targeted by 2 unmanned aerial vehicles. Bahrain's civil defense put out a fire in a facility targeted by Iran. PBS. The entire Gulf was under attack simultaneously. Saudi Arabia intercepting missiles aimed at Riyadh. Kuwait losing radar at its international airport. Oman taking drone strikes. Bahrain fighting fires. And now Yemen adding a new front aimed directly at Israel. This is not a war anymore. This is a regional catastrophe in slow motion. And at the center of all of it is a question that nobody in Washington or Tel Aviv or Riyadh wants to answer out loud. How many fronts can you fight at once? How many missile defense systems can you run simultaneously? How many soldiers can you position in how many countries before the entire architecture starts to creak? The axis of resistance, that network of proxies and allies Iran has built over 4 decades, was designed to answer that question for you. It was designed so that America and Israel could never fight just one enemy. They always have to fight all of them at once. Hezbollah in the north firing into Israel. Iraqi militias targeting American bases in Iraq and Jordan. Iran firing directly at Gulf states and at Israel. And now the Houthis re-entering from the south. A professor of international relations at the London School of Economics said through Saturday's strikes, the Houthis have given the Americans and the Israelis a taste of what is to come. He added that the American-Israeli war in Iran is really no longer a limited war. It is an all-out regional conflict. What I worry about is that it is no longer just a military conflict. It is now an economic war that involves the supply chains, the global energy system, and its waterways. Hudson Institute. An economic war. That phrase is the most important one in this entire story. Because you might live far from Yemen, you might live far from Israel, you might live far from Saudi Arabia or Iran, but you do not live far from the economy, you do not live far from fuel prices, you do not live far from the supply chains that put food on your table and goods in your home. Global shipping and oil markets are already in turmoil after Iran responded to the American-Israeli attack by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, prompting what the International Energy Agency described as the worst disruption in the history of the oil market. The Washington Post, the worst disruption in the history of the oil market. And the Houthis just made it worse. Now, let's talk about the diplomatic picture. Because even as missiles fly and sirens sound, there are people in quiet rooms trying to find a way out of this. Pakistan's Foreign Affairs Ministry confirmed it will begin hosting a meeting of foreign ministers from Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia to discuss regional developments, including the war. Pakistan's Prime Minister held a one-hour call with the Iranian president. PBS Pakistan is playing a fascinating role in this conflict, acting as an intermediary, a bridge between Tehran and Washington. In a war this dangerous, sometimes the most important work happens in Islamabad, not on the battlefield. Ukraine signed a new defense agreement with Qatar as Gulf nations seek to harness Kyiv's expertise in drone warfare. PBS, even Ukraine is present in this story. The world's most active drone warfare theater exchanging knowledge with a Gulf state caught in the crossfire of a war it did not start. The interconnectedness of this moment is staggering. And Iran, just hours before the Houthis fired their first missiles, offered a small but significant gesture. Prior to the Houthi attack, there appeared to be a breakthrough as Tehran agreed to allow humanitarian aid and agricultural shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, accepting a request from the United Nations. Military times. Iran said this week that the Red Sea inlet was fair game for retaliatory attacks due to the presence of the American aircraft carrier. Any facilities supporting the carrier group will be regarded as potential targets by Iran's armed forces. The Washington Post, potential targets. A carrier group is a floating city. Thousands of sailors, dozens of aircraft, billions of dollars, and Iran is now saying it is a target. This is the world on March 28, 2026. A war that began 28 days ago with a midnight video posted to social media. A war that has already killed more than a dozen American service members, wounded hundreds more, sent oil prices to historic levels, disrupted global shipping, rattled stock markets, spread military fire across Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and now Israel from Yemen. And today, a new chapter opened, one that almost everyone hoped would not open, one that analysts warned about for weeks, one that Iran held back deliberately until the moment it would hurt most. Yemen entered the war. A Houthi supporter said Saturday's strike will complete a ring of fire against United States and Israeli operations. SOF News, a ring of fire. Picture that map again. Israel at the center, Iran to the east firing missiles, Hezbollah to the north firing rockets, Iraqi militias to the northeast targeting American bases, and now Yemen to the south firing ballistic missiles across 1,800 kilometers of open sky. The ring is not complete yet, but it is closing. And as the sirens faded in Beersheba on Saturday morning, as the intercepted missile fell somewhere in the desert, as the all-clear sounded and residents emerged from their shelters, the Houthi spokesperson was already back on television. He said the attacks would continue. He said the objectives had not yet been achieved. He said more operations were coming. In a war this complex, in a conflict this interconnected, in a moment this dangerous, every single development matters. Every missile fired from every direction matters. Every diplomat making every phone call in every back room matters. And every person watching from every corner of the world, watching fuel prices and food prices and stock prices and wondering what comes next, matters.